Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll be seeing what's making the headlines with columnist at The Independent, James Rampton, and economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. Hello to you both. Well, before we get into it, let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages. Pressure intensifies on Israel to negotiate release of Gaza hostages. That is on the front page of The Guardian. The Financial Times also leads on the situation in Israel, with the US warning of a risk of escalation in the war as tensions continue to spiral across the Middle East. The Daily Mail reports on Home Secretary Suella Braverman's fury at the Met Police after officers stood by as pro-Palestinian demonstrators called for a jihad against Israel. As has the Times, its headline, Braverman takes on Met chief over jihad protest. Meanwhile, grit and bear it, the Metro focuses on a different warning. The Met Office says winter is well on its way. The Mirror has a tribute to the football legend Sir Bobby Charlton, led by his younger brother Tommy. And finally, hair we grow. The Daily Star says scientists have found the genes for baldness. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on your screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And as I said, we are joined tonight by columnist at The Independent, James Rampton, and economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. Welcome to you both. It's lovely to have you here with me in the studio tonight. Again, you know, it's the same story that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks on the front pages of a lot of the papers, beginning with the Financial Times, which has its leading story. US warns of conflict escalation risk as tensions rise across the Middle East. A lot of this particular article focused on what the US is doing. Kate, I wonder whether you think this is the US making everyone know that it's very serious about standing by Israel and de-escalating what it might see as a regional contagion.
Well, I think both of those points are very important here. The US has been very clear to the extent that it backs Israel throughout the past few weeks. However, we now have America considering the potential of regional conflict and what that could mean, not just for the region, but for the world. And these are comments from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who is talking about concern about potential escalation. And I think you can tell over this weekend that America has been making real efforts to de-escalate, to prioritize the hostages and negotiations to get them back, and to be very cautious when it comes to that looming ground invasion that Israel is planning. There are some comments from Austin here that are not aimed at Hamas. They're not necessarily even aimed at Hezbollah. They're much more likely aimed at Iran.
What comments are you picking out there?
So he says if any group or any country is looking to widen this conflict, take advantage of this very unfortunate situation that we see, our advice is don't. Very clear cut. And Iran has been poking at the U.S. over the past few days, making comments about the U.S. sending military support to Israel. And you can tell that the U.S. is really trying to speak to Iran in many ways to try to de-escalate this as much as it can.
It's very interesting, though, as well, because whilst we see Iran potentially as this puppet master, perhaps, of Hezbollah in Lebanon, of Hamas in Gaza, even if we go to Yemen, and there were some rockets fired out of Yemen earlier this week, if we think of the Houthis in Yemen as well, we might see Iran as this puppet master. But as I was talking earlier tonight to a former national security advisor at the White House, and he was saying, actually, often they're not necessarily in control of all of these groups. And so it's very unclear whether Iran is orchestrating this or whether it's simply set the scene for this to happen. So with that in mind, I wonder, James, where the US find itself, because it is, as we say, trying to de-escalate. But does it have the power to play peacemaker in this region anymore?
Well, that's a very good question. I think they're really aiming these comments, I agree with Kate, at Iran, because over the years, Iran has set up what it calls a ring of fire, which is a network of militias, not only in Lebanon, but in Syria, which was bombed last night by Israel. Also, in other countries nearby, Iraq even has some Iranian-backed militias. So there's a sense that all these proxies are ready to go. And this is the absolute disaster could be the contagion that Rishi Sunak talked about this week. If, God forbid, Iran launched a strike against Israel, the US would be compelled to intervene. And the only people to win out of that would be Russia and China. So it's incumbent upon the US to warn them, as Lloyd Austin said, don't. Echoing what Biden said when he was in Israel this week, he said, we made mistakes post 9/11. We went into Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people died and the country is in total chaos. We went into Afghanistan. 20 years later, they withdrew with their tails between their legs and the Taliban retook control. If you escalate and draw in other countries, there's no way that you're going to win the war, and you're certainly not going to win the peace. Rumsfeld famously said, we don't do peace, we only do war. But we've got to be thinking about peace too, and that involves de-escalating.
To your point, when you are working with or funding militants, they might be out of your control. You can't necessarily claim control over them all the time. So you're not always dealing with rational actors. I mean, you rarely are. So the idea that Iran can actually pull every puppet string and control everything, given who they've decided to ally with, that probably is nearly impossible, to your point. Israel is claiming this evening that one of the terrorists was carrying on them plans for chemical weapons.
Yeah, that was, in fact, a story that our
right. So there's a lot that is in control.
Yeah, exactly right. And obviously, as we say, here at Sky News, we have yet to verify those claims. They were made by the Israeli President Isaac Herzog to us today, but we are trying to work out, what might have happened then. But of course, if we're talking about chemical weapons, that is very serious. They were, just for the viewers, they were found reportedly, according to the president of Israel, these were documents found on the body of one of the Hamas fighters attacking in one of the kibbutzes on October the 7th, which showed instructions on how to make some sort of chemical weapon. Of course, that would take it to a very serious place. And again, we hear those echoes of 2001, 2003, when we think of those types of weapons. Thoughts there cast back, and so many questions to answer in that. I want to move us on, though, to The Guardian, the front page there. Pressure intensifying on Israel to negotiate the hostage release. And, of course, that is part of this caution that President Biden has urged when he says we stand absolutely with Israel and its right to defend itself. The note of caution may in part, obviously, be about the history that the US has itself, but also regarding these hostages that are in Gaza, a very tricky line to tread, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, look at the efforts, fantastic efforts brokered by Qatar to release just 2 hostages. There are reportedly 212 still there, and there's a network of tunnels underneath Gaza. It's called the Gaza Metro. It's 300 miles long. It's 25 times longer than the Gaza Strip itself. It's impossible to find people in there, and they think the hostages and many weapons are in there. So it's an extremely difficult task to try and extricate those people. But it would be much, much harder if Israel had launched a ground war, because how do you send in negotiators in between the tanks? That's impossible. So America's absolutely right, not only to press for the release of the American hostages, which is also, very urgent, but there are so many other nationalities. There are 17 Thais, for instance, 7 Brits, 8 Germans, 7 French. So there's a multitude of nations involved, and they will be unsavable if a war starts, because who will be able to find them in that rabbit warren of tunnels? So I absolutely commend their efforts to try and put the brakes on the more hawkish elements within the IDF.
It's interesting that you say that. You mentioned at the beginning there that it was Qatari officials who negotiated that release of the 2 US citizen hostages. And that sort of speaks to my point. I mean, Qatar, in effect, funds Hamas because it pays for the governance of the Gaza Strip. If they've got the purse strings, I wonder if they are the people who need to be talked to for all of that sort of hostage negotiation. And that, again, casts the US in a very precarious light, because it is trying to do a lot here, but having already stated its claim, the Arab world thinks that the US is on Israel's side. It's a really tricky line, isn't it, Kate?
Well, the US is on Israel's side. Again, the US has made that extremely clear, not just in the past few weeks, but historically. It certainly has. But I don't think there's any sense that this is just going to be a conversation or negotiation between Israel and the Gaza militants. This is going to be a worldwide effort, really, to potentially release these 200-plus people. Joe Biden has been on the phone today to Canada, France, the UK, Germany, and Italy. And as you point out, a lot of those countries have people who are being held hostage right now.
But it's so interesting because they're all talking amongst themselves and not together. It's very hard to get them to talk together. The Cairo summit, Arab countries, the US wasn't there.
Israel wasn't there.
Israel wasn't there. I mean, you know, very difficult to see how they'll make any sort of progress there. Let's quickly leave that for a second and go over to the Daily Mail. We're nearly out of time, but I just want to have a look at this. Suella Braverman today demanding an explanation from police after they stood by as pro-Palestinian demonstrators called for a jihad against Israel. Kate, what did you make of that?
This is a tricky balance between upholding the right to free speech, and that sometimes is the right to say really ugly, horrible things, and then cracking down when people have broken the law by inciting violence or actively supporting a terrorist group. I mean, for me, the police are insisting that nobody broke the law. So this is going to be a debate between the Home Secretary Suella Braverman and the Met Police over this. But I compare it to the Sarah Everard vigil, when police were actually quite happy to storm in and hold down women who were mourning Sarah Everard, to put them in handcuffs, to pin them on the ground. And yet there have, at this particular protest, not been arrests. I think one does have to question the politics of this.
Kate, you would be for a slightly heavier-handed approach,
well, I'm not sure. Certainly not if people really haven't broken the law, but you compare those things and you just have to question what the priorities are.
James, very quickly, because
I think the danger is that the government is seen to control the police, and I think that's a dangerous road to go down. Robert Jenrick today said that they were inciting terrorist violence. There's also ambiguity, according to experts, about what the word jihad means. And I think the Met have used that reason for not intervening. But I agree with you, it's a really, really vexed question.
And certainly a lot more discussion to have on what this law is about, inciting terrorist violence and what constitutes that. Well, you're watching the press preview, and with me is the columnist at The Independent, James Rampton, and economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. We're going to go straight back into our stories. Of course, the big story here in the UK, Storm Babette. In the south, we barely felt anything, but in the north, it was a totally different story. I mean, the numbers are fairly grim to read, and the devastation to homes as well. The front page of the Metro, the Met warns winter is coming, grit and bear it. So if we thought that this was it, we're certainly wrong, aren't we, James?
We are, and they've quoted the famous line from Game of Thrones there, winter is coming, and I fear that similar tumultuous events may be arriving in the UK very soon. Quite a nice pun, grit and bear it. But to be terribly serious, 9 people have died. The storms have been apocalyptic. And we've seen some really, really heartbreaking scenes. I watched earlier Paul Gilbert, that poor man who'd gone into the house in Chesterfield where his mother lived, hoping that she'd escaped the flood, and he found her body floating in the front room. I was virtually in tears. It was such a heartbreak.
It was. Our correspondent, our correspondent Thomas Moore, who was there speaking to him, and clearly a man, you know, potentially still in shock, the way that he was talking about discovering his mother. And
Can you imagine that?
But the fact that he had wished that he had not been the one to discover, he thought that someone else would have got there first. And I guess that raises a question of how prepared we were as a country and as local authorities, but also the fire and rescue response. And it has been incredible, the pulling together of that response. But were we prepared enough? The
infrastructure is not in place, and it hasn't been, and this is a well-known fact. And it is remarkable to me that government spending and tax receipts can be at an all-time high, and yet the very basics are clearly not getting done and are not up to scratch. It is disappointing is a very mild way of putting it. And unfortunately, the bad news continues, because the fear now is that with all of this water, some of it's going to turn to ice, and that presents its own dangers. And as you say, 9 people have already died, and this could make for some pretty dicey scenarios.
And absolutely, what it will do as well is to stop those people who want to go back to their homes. It'll take them a lot longer to get back to those homes. So no, really devastating pictures that we've been seeing there. Let's go to, I mean, if I can call it a bit of lighter news. It's odd when the light story of the day is a death, but it was a death after a very long and celebrated life of Sir Bobby Charlton. I mean, you must have loved this man growing up, James.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm obviously very devastated we're not doing the story about the cure for baldness, because I have a personal interest in that.
11:30.
We will get there.
I am an Arsenal fan, and I love Bobby Charlton. I thought he was a fantastic role model. Everyone said, you know, Gary Lineker, all the greats today said he was the greatest ever player, but most of all, he was a gentleman. If you think of what he went through the Munich disaster, very many of his young colleagues died, and 10 years later he helped us win the World Cup, us, England, and United to win the European Cup. And there's a lovely picture there of him with his brother, Jack, who also won the World Cup in 1966. And it's lovely because, as many people will know, there was a feud between them over the treatment of their mother. Jack felt that perhaps Bobby hadn't always treated the mother as Jack was hoping, but they reconciled before Jack died. And the third brother, Tommy, says, a really nice line, if ever there was a place reserved in heaven, it's for Bob. He and Jack were everybody's heroes, and I think we all would echo that tonight.
And I think that is it, isn't it? Sort of national treasure, someone who ignited that dream right at the beginning for England, which has been so hard to come by ever since, but certainly a national treasure. Kate, even with your American accent, were you aware of Bobby Charlton? You could be honest.
No, of course. A hugely successful career and, as you say, quite a unique experience for England to win the World Cup.
Yeah.
So these men, certainly do stand out. As a surface football supporter, I can't compare to that tribute.
But there may Gareth Southgate probably watching him. And a wonderful anecdote I heard as well, that his father, Bobby Charlton's father, was underground in the mines at some of his most incredible moments because he didn't want to ask for that extra day off. Quite an extraordinary life. We're out of time. Stay with us. We'll be back in an hour. Thank you very much, James and Kate.